Margaret Bennett thought she had everything she ever wanted: a loving husband, 2 children who'd grown into fine adults, and a cozy home filled with steady routines and quiet comfort. She believed her life was complete, safe inside that warm familiarity, until one ordinary Thursday afternoon changed everything. The phone rang, once, then again, and a stranger's voice, calm yet urgent, whispered words she wasn't prepared to hear about the person she trusted most. Suddenly, the foundation of her world trembled. In those seconds, the future she envisioned began to unravel. She stood in her kitchen, heart pounding, face cold with confusion, as the voice delivered the first crack in a story that would force her to question everything she thought she knew. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Margaret Bennett stood in her kitchen, the phone still pressed to her ear, her mind trying to catch up with the words that had just been spoken. The voice on the other end was female, steady but carrying a weight that made Margaret's chest tighten. "You don't know me," the caller had said, "but you need to hear the truth about your husband, before it's too late." The words hung in the air long after the call ended, as though they had seeped into the very walls of the room. She set the phone down on the counter, her fingers trembling slightly. Outside, the rain tapped against the window in a slow, unhurried rhythm that felt painfully at odds with the rush of thoughts flooding her mind. Richard was at work, or at least that's where he said he would be. He always called if he was going to be late. He always sent a quick message, a habit that had become one of those quiet reassurances in their marriage. But today, silence. She took a deep breath and tried to steady herself, telling herself it could have been a mistake, a wrong number, even a prank. But the voice hadn't felt random. It had known her name, her husband's name. It had carried a certainty that could not be faked. Margaret reached for the kettle, pouring hot water into her mug, but even as the steam rose, she realized she couldn't remember why she'd boiled it in the first place. Her thoughts drifted backward, seeking comfort in the memory of their morning together. Richard had kissed her cheek before leaving, smelling faintly of aftershave and coffee, the way he always did. They had talked about the weekend, about maybe inviting their son and daughter over for dinner. Everything had seemed normal. Margaret's life had been built on moments like these, small, reliable pieces that fit together to form the picture she cherished. 25 years of marriage had its share of challenges, of course, but nothing that had ever shaken her belief in them. In their tidy 2-story home on Maple Lane, she found peace in routine, morning jogs through the neighborhood, afternoons spent tending the garden, evenings curled on the sofa with Richard watching their favorite crime dramas. Friends often said she and Richard were the solid ones, the couple everyone could count on. Yet as she stood there now, staring at the phone on the counter, a quiet unease began to creep in. She remembered the business trip last month, the one Richard said had been extended at the last minute. She remembered the late-night calls he would take in his study, closing the door behind him. She remembered finding a receipt in his jacket pocket from a restaurant they'd never been to together. She had pushed those moments aside, chalking them up to work stress or coincidence. But now, with the caller's voice still echoing in her mind, those small things began to feel like loose threads tugging at the edges of her life. Margaret picked up the phone again, scrolling to Richard's contact. She pressed the call button and waited. 1 ring, 2 rings, then voicemail. She tried again. Still nothing. She considered texting but stopped herself. If what the caller had hinted was true, she needed to be careful. She replayed the conversation in her mind, searching for anything she might have missed. The caller had given her an address, one she didn't recognize. "Go there," the woman had said, "and you'll see for yourself." She hesitated. Every instinct told her to dismiss it, to wait for Richard to come home and explain. But another part of her, a part she didn't often listen to, urged her forward. She slipped on her coat, grabbed her car keys, and stepped outside. The rain had grown heavier, pooling in the cracks of the driveway. As she slid into the driver's seat, she glanced at the house in the rearview mirror. It looked the same as always, warm light spilling from the kitchen window, the place she had always thought of as her safe haven. The GPS loaded slowly as she typed in the address, her fingers moving almost on their own. She didn't know what she expected to find, but she knew she couldn't ignore this. The engine hummed to life, the wipers swaying back and forth, clearing her view of the wet, glistening road ahead. Margaret took one last breath, as though sealing herself into a decision she couldn't undo. The caller's words repeated in her mind, each one striking harder than before. "You don't know me, but you need to hear the truth about your husband before it's too late." She gripped the wheel, turned onto the main road, and began driving toward the unknown. Margaret slowed her car as the GPS announced she had reached her destination. The street was unfamiliar, narrower, older, lined with modest brick townhouses that bore the marks of years gone by. She cut the engine and sat for a moment, letting the wipers finish their sweep before silence settled inside the car. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle, making the air outside appear almost silver in the glow of the street lamps. She scanned the row of homes until her eyes caught the number the caller had given her. It wasn't remarkable in any way. A pale blue townhouse with a small porch, its paint peeling slightly at the edges. A bicycle leaned against the railing, its tires muddy. A light glowed from inside, casting thin vertical lines through the blinds. For a long moment, Margaret sat frozen, her hands resting on the steering wheel, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She was about to tell herself this was ridiculous, that she should leave and go home, when the front door opened. Her breath caught. Richard stepped out. He was carrying a bag of groceries in one arm, an umbrella in the other. His shoulders looked relaxed, his expression softer than the one he usually wore after work. And then, a woman appeared in the doorway. Younger, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, she smiled at him in a way that spoke of familiarity. She reached out, taking the groceries from his arm as if this was something they'd done 100 times before. But it was the small child that made Margaret's chest tighten. A little boy, no more than 4 or 5, clung to the woman's leg before running toward Richard, who bent down to scoop him up effortlessly. Richard's face, the face Margaret had known for 25 years, transformed into one of warmth and affection, a tenderness that felt both familiar and foreign in this moment. Margaret's fingers curled tightly around the steering wheel. She wanted to get out, to march across the street, to demand an explanation. But something kept her rooted in place, a strange, almost primal instinct that told her the truth would not be so easily revealed. She waited until Richard disappeared inside again, the door closing softly behind them. Her drive home was a blur. Every streetlight, every passing car felt distant. She replayed what she'd seen over and over, searching for some version of the truth that didn't hurt. But each time, the image of Richard lifting that little boy into his arms shattered any attempt to soften it. By the time she reached Maple Lane, her stomach was in knots. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table, a notebook in front of her, the pages empty except for the address she'd scribbled hastily at the top. She began making a list. Dates Richard had been working late, weekends he'd been out of town, moments she now realized had holes big enough to drive a truck through. In the days that followed, she moved carefully, quietly. While Richard showered in the mornings, she went through the pockets of his jackets, the drawers in his study. She found bank statements with transactions she didn't recognize, cash withdrawals from ATMs in parts of the city they never visited, charges from restaurants she'd never heard of. She found slips of paper with phone numbers and no names. She called one of the numbers, letting it ring twice before hanging up. She couldn't bring herself to speak, not yet. Instead, she began keeping the notes in a shoebox she hid under a stack of blankets in the guest room. Each piece of information felt like another stone in a growing pile of evidence. On the 5th day, she opened her front door to collect the morning paper and froze. Resting on top of it was an envelope, no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, the words printed in block letters. "Stop looking or you'll regret it." Margaret stood in her doorway, the cold air rushing in around her, the message burning in her hand. Someone knew. Someone was watching. Margaret's mornings had always been predictable. The quiet clink of coffee cups, Richard's familiar footsteps down the hall, the sound of the local news drifting from the small kitchen TV. But now, each sound seemed weighted with suspicion. Every word Richard spoke felt like it carried a shadow behind it. She listened more than she answered, watched more than she spoke. Her shoebox of notes had grown into two. The bank statements alone painted a picture she couldn't ignore. Large cash withdrawals followed by days Richard claimed to be traveling for business meetings. Hotel charges in cities they had never visited together. Payments to an account she didn't recognize, all marked with vague descriptors like consulting services. She spent hours cross-referencing dates and receipts, building a private timeline. One afternoon, she decided to follow him. It was a Wednesday. Richard had left in his dark blue sedan after telling her he'd be in a conference downtown until evening. She waited 15 minutes, then slipped her coat on and eased her own car out of the driveway. She kept far enough back to avoid notice, her eyes fixed on the shape of his taillights through the early morning fog. He didn't go downtown. Instead, he drove toward the industrial side of the city, where the streets narrowed and the buildings grew older, the paint peeling from brick walls and windows covered with rusted grates. She watched him park in front of an unremarkable warehouse with no sign above the door. A woman emerged as he stepped out, the same woman she'd seen at the townhouse. Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She half expected them to embrace, but they didn't. Instead, they spoke quickly, almost urgently, their eyes darting toward the street as though afraid of being seen. The woman handed Richard a manila envelope, which he slipped into his leather briefcase without looking inside. Margaret waited until Richard drove away before following the woman at a distance. She didn't lead Margaret to another home, but to a small storefront cafe, where she disappeared inside. Margaret parked and, after several minutes, walked in herself. The place was quiet. The low hum of a refrigerator and the faint smell of burnt espresso hung in the air. The woman was at a corner table, scrolling through her phone. Margaret approached slowly, unsure what she would say. The woman looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to wary recognition. "You're his wife," the woman said quietly, as though the words themselves could bring trouble. Margaret sat down opposite her. "I don't know who you are. I don't know what's going on, but I need to." The woman hesitated before leaning forward. "My name's Elena, and I'm not what you think. I'm not with him." She paused, her voice low. "But I work for him. Or at least I used to. I thought it was legal. I thought it was just moving inventory, documents, supplies. Then I realized it wasn't." Margaret felt her breath quicken. "Wasn't what?" "Wasn't legal," Elena whispered. "Richard is moving more than just paper through those warehouses, and he's using accounts in your name. If anyone looks closely enough, you're already part of it." Margaret felt as though the room had tilted. Her mind flashed back to the bank transactions, the unexplained charges, the nights he'd been away on business. It wasn't an affair. It was something else entirely. Something that could destroy her in a way she had never imagined. Elena's eyes darted toward the door. "If I were you, I'd stop asking questions. For your own sake." Margaret left the cafe with her pulse pounding in her ears, the street outside spinning into a blur of headlights and cold wind. She had thought the worst thing she could discover was that her husband loved someone else. But now she wasn't sure which truth was more dangerous. When she pulled into her driveway, a fresh envelope was waiting on her front porch. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph of her, standing in the cafe doorway just an hour earlier. Margaret Bennett had lived her entire adult life believing that truth was a fixed thing, solid, unshakable. You could point to it, measure it, trust it to stand no matter what storms came. But now, truth felt like smoke in her hands. Every time she thought she grasped it, it slipped away, replaced by something darker, more dangerous. That night, after finding the Polaroid, she didn't sleep. She sat in the armchair near the window, watching the street outside. The neighborhood was still, the occasional sweep of headlights from passing cars, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But every shadow seemed to move. Every sound seemed amplified. The idea that someone had been close enough to take her photograph without her noticing made her skin crawl. By morning, her resolve hardened. She couldn't simply wait for answers to come to her. She needed to know exactly what Richard had been doing and why her name was on bank accounts and transactions she'd never authorized. She started with the numbers she'd written down from his phone bill, the ones that appeared again and again next to large cash withdrawals. One belonged to a logistics company she'd never heard of, another to a number with no listing at all, and the third belonged to Elena. When she called, the line went dead before the first ring finished. Moments later, her phone buzzed with a single text. "Don't call me. It's not safe." 3 days passed before she saw Elena again. This time Elena asked Margaret to meet her not in the cafe, but in a public park, broad daylight. She looked tense, scanning the benches and pathways as she spoke. "You need to understand," Elena began. "Richard isn't just running some side business. He's part of a network. Documents, goods, sometimes even people, moved without anyone asking questions. And he's good at it. Too good. That's why they trust him." Margaret's throat tightened. "Why use my name? Why risk that?" Elena looked at her with something between pity and fear. "Because no one suspects you. You're clean. You're safe. Or you were. He set up shell accounts in your name so that if anything went wrong, it wouldn't point to him first." The weight of it settled like a stone in her chest. She had thought she was unraveling a story about betrayal in love. But this was about survival, about her freedom, about the possibility that she could end up in prison for crimes she hadn't even known existed. Margaret didn't know then that she wasn't the only one searching for answers. Quietly, without her knowledge, federal investigators had already been watching Richard. They'd tracked the movement of unregistered cargo from ports to warehouses, mapping each step of the route. And in the middle of their web of red strings and photographs was his face. It was a Tuesday evening when the knock came. 2 detectives stood at her door, plainclothes, but with the air of men used to being obeyed. They asked her about Richard's travel habits, his business partners, his warehouse visits. She answered what she could, carefully omitting the fact that she'd followed him once. When they left, one of them said quietly, "If you see him before we do, Mrs. Bennett, tell him we're done being patient." The next day, Richard was gone. His car wasn't in the driveway when she woke up. His phone went straight to voicemail. His closet was missing several suits, a pair of shoes, and the leather briefcase she'd seen him put the envelope in. It was as though he'd evaporated, leaving nothing but questions behind. Margaret called Elena in a panic, but this time the number was disconnected. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from her, the faint ticking of the clock filling the silence. Night fell quickly that evening, and with it came a cold, unshakable sense that the walls were closing in. She made tea, more for something to do than to drink it, and had just lifted the mug when her phone began to ring. She froze when she saw the number, the same unlisted one from that Thursday afternoon weeks ago. Slowly, she answered. The voice was the same, calm, measured, male. "You've been busy, Margaret," the caller said, "but you've been looking in the wrong direction. Richard isn't the only one you need to worry about. There's someone closer to you than you realize, someone who's already decided how this ends, and if you don't listen carefully, you won't see it coming." The line went dead before she could speak. Margaret sat in the dim kitchen, the mug cooling in her hands, her heart pounding hard enough to drown out the rain against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, and for the first time she wondered if knowing the truth was more dangerous than the lies. The voice from that phone call lingered in Margaret's mind like the echo of a nightmare she couldn't wake from. For days she replayed the words, "Someone closer to you than you realize." They scratched at the edges of her thoughts until they became an obsession. Who could it be? A neighbor? A friend? Someone she saw every day but never questioned? The answer came sooner than she expected. On a rainy Thursday morning, she was pulling her coat from the closet when she noticed something wedged behind the lining, a small digital recorder. Her hands trembled as she switched it on. First, static, then a man's voice, not Richard's, but one she recognized instantly. It was Detective Hall, one of the officers who had stood in her doorway weeks earlier. The same man who had told her, "We're done being patient. You'll get your cut when she's in," Hall's voice said on the recording. "She'll never see it coming. All we have to do is keep her scared and asking the wrong questions." Margaret's stomach lurched. The caller was him. The realization hit like a physical blow. The man supposedly protecting her had been manipulating her from the very beginning, steering her toward half-truths, feeding her just enough fear to keep her isolated and pliable. The breakthrough came when federal agents, not the local police, stormed the old dockside warehouse Richard had been using. They didn't find him there, but they did find enough evidence to bring charges. False invoices, smuggled goods, a ledger with coded initials, and photographs of multiple individuals under surveillance. One of those photographs was of Margaret. It was almost midnight when they finally caught Richard. He was pulled from the back seat of a black sedan at a gas station 2 counties over, trying to buy a bus ticket under a false name. When they brought him into custody, Margaret was there, not to see him as the man she had once loved, but to see him as the stranger he had become. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence. His once confident smile was gone, replaced by the dull stare of a man who knew the walls had closed in. The courtroom was suffocating. Cameras clicked, journalists whispered, and Margaret sat stiff-backed in the gallery as the charges were read. The prosecution painted Richard as the architect of a smuggling ring that funneled illegal shipments through legitimate businesses in her name. Elena testified under immunity. She revealed that she had once been part of the operation but had tried to leave. Richard, she said, had kept her in line through threats, and through Hall, who was not only his contact in law enforcement, but his silent partner. When the defense tried to shift blame toward Margaret, painting her as a willing participant, she felt her breath catch. For a moment, she feared the jury would believe it. But the paper trail told another story, and the voice recording sealed the fate of both Richard and Hall. After 2 weeks of testimony, the verdict came, guilty on all counts. Richard and Hall were sentenced to decades in federal prison. Elena walked free, though not without the weight of her own complicity. When it was over, Margaret expected to feel relief. Instead, she felt hollow. The man she had loved for 22 years was gone, not dead, but stripped from her life like a page torn from a book. The home they had built together now felt like a shell. Every photograph, every piece of furniture whispered of lies. She sold the house, moved to a smaller place 2 towns over, tried to build something resembling a new life. But there were nights, long, quiet nights, when she would still wake to the sound of her own phone ringing in her dreams. 6 months after the trial, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a single manila envelope. She hesitated before opening it, half afraid of what it might contain. Inside were photocopies of bank documents, not from Richard, but from her own brother. Dates, transfers, signatures, all connected to the very accounts Richard had used. In the corner of one page was a note in neat block letters. "Betrayal runs in the family." Margaret sat in her kitchen staring at the papers, realizing the web she thought she had escaped might never truly be gone. She had chased the truth for months, and now she wondered if she had only ever scratched the surface. Sometimes the people we love are strangers wearing familiar faces. Sometimes betrayal isn't a single act, but a chain, each link forged by someone we thought we could trust. Margaret Harper learned that truth is not always the light we seek. Sometimes it's the shadow we can never outrun. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.